The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty podcast. I am your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I'm welcoming back to the show again for the first time in a really long time, Michele Schindler. Michele, welcome.
Hello, how are you?
I am pretty good. I'm very excited to have you on the show. I feel like we've talked in the past. I think we did an interview. You did a guest host episode on, I think it was Francis Lovell for the show, but that was probably back in what, 2020?
I think it was even before that. I think it wasn't during COVID, so it's years.
Oh my gosh, it has been a long. I'm sorry it took so long to have you back on the show, but I'm so happy to have you here today to talk about a woman in history that I literally didn't even know existed until your book, Alice Chaucer. So let's start out because I'm so curious about how did you learn about her? What got you interested in her in the first place?
Well, I was reading about, as you said, I my first book was about Francis Lovell, so The Wars of the Roses, and I was reading about some sort of less discussed people like Francis Lovell and also John de la Pole, that's the brother-in-law of Edward IV and Richard III, and Alice Chaucer was his mother. So I was researching him and she popped up and I was like, she's just so fascinating. How is she so overlooked? There's not a single biography about her, and this couldn't go on, so I had to do it.
I love this. And I don't want to go too much into this yet, but for those who are listening and who are wondering what we're talking about today and wanting to know if there's any connection to the Tudors, there is, and we will get to it later. And so I want you to hold tight because we will get to that Tudor connection probably closer to the end. So stick with it. But before we really go into Alice's life today, I want you to kind of maybe set the scene for the viewers and listeners today on the time period in which Alice lived so that we understand maybe who were the key figures of the time, who were the monarchs when she was born and throughout her life, just so we can kind of paint a picture.
Yes, well, we've already mentioned the Wars of the Roses. That's towards the end of her pretty long life. But when she was born, the king was Henry the Fourth, so the first Lancastrian king, and he hadn't even been king for very long. There was still a lot of turmoil going on, and she was actually somewhat tenuously, but still connected to Henry the Fourth because Henry's father, that's John of Gaunt, was married was married to his mistress as his third and last wife. That's Catherine Swynford, and Catherine's sister Philippa was actually Alice's grandmother.
Mm.
So there was a connection there,
Everybody's
and
related.
everybody is related, but they're quite closely related at least. And her father and Henry the Fourth were about the same age, and they would have known each other quite well. So that probably would have helped Alice in the first years of her life. John of Gaunt was actually quite interested in Alice's father, that's Thomas Chaucer, and his siblings. There are grants on record that he made for him and his sister Elizabeth. So it stands to reason he and Henry the Fourth would have known each other even before Henry became king. And Thomas was quite an important man by himself, and he was not unimportant under Richard III. But after Henry the Fourth took the throne, his race really started. So we can assume that probably Henry the Fourth wanted somebody he knew and trusted in a position of power. So he started helping Thomas raise his statues, which was not quite as easy as you think because Thomas was a commoner. So Alice was actually herself born a commoner, which makes it even more impressive what she later went on to do and how important she became. She was born a very rich commoner, but a commoner. And well, when she was still only a very small child, not older than 10, um, she was married. Shall I go on already with that? Because
Eh,
it becomes kind of important, and that's before Henry V really comes into it.
Yeah, I think before we go into that, and I do want to talk about all of that, of course, but before we go into that, I am very intrigued that you were able to find information to write an entire book on a woman from this time period because she was born in the early 15th century. And
1404, probably.
yeah, so I mean, it's hard enough for Tudor times to find information about women, but you were able to find a significant amount of information about Alice, and I'm curious how that is or why that is. Why is there so much information about her out there?
She's actually unusually well recorded for a woman of the time, for really a person of the time. There's a lot of men who aren't that well recorded. And that was because she was, well, people noticed her. She was said to be extremely beautiful. That probably helped because, men writing the chronicles and all that. And she was very outspoken, very opinionated, and she was meant to be very charming. So she came in contact with a lot of people who just wanted to speak about her, to record her, and a lot of it is also that's, I would say, the main reason why we have such a lot of information, but also some of it is really just lucky that parts of her last will and testament has have survived. That's pure luck.
It's absolutely amazing. I'm glad that you found her. I'm glad that there was so much information about her because I really think she had a fascinating life. So now we can get back to that. Now we can get back to her early years. If you want to go into that first marriage that she had so early on.
Yes, that would have been just shortly after Henry V came to the throne, and he already started making noises about invading France. That was sort of the last phase of the so-called Hundred Years' War. Um, Under Henry the Fourth, there hadn't really been a lot going on because honestly, he had his hands full with all that went on in England because not a lot of people were very happy about him. They hadn't been happy about Richard the Second either, but they also weren't happy about him. Anyway, so around that time, her parents would have been looking around for a marriage for her because she had no siblings, or at least no surviving siblings, no siblings that we know of. By around 14 or something, she was definitely their only child, and she would have been their heir. And Thomas Chaucer was rich. So she wasn't a noble woman, but she would have been an interesting um, choice for a woman because she had connections and she had money. So they looked around for a man to marry her, and then they decided on one of those marriages that you always connect with the Middle Ages, even though they're not that common as we now think, where the man was like 30 and she was 10.
Yeah.
Maybe she was 11. That's the most she could have been. Um, and her first husband was John Philip. His name was John Philip, and he was actually a close friend of Henry V because, of course, he was. Uh, and he wasn't a noble, but he was a gentleman, a knight. And he'd also been married a couple times before, and it seems to have been one of those typical money arrangements. He got money from Thomas Chaucer, and he then agreed to give money to his daughter and all that. And they were married in either 1414 or 1415. It's not quite certain, but it's probably 1414. So Alice would have been 10 or just about to turn 10. And then absolutely nothing changed in her life. She continued living with her parents.
Mm.
That was quite common. Usually, such young wives would have only moved in with their husband when they were around 14 or 15. So it
Okay.
probably was planned like that. But it really didn't happen like this because, as we've established, Henry V had other plans. He was wanting to invade France. And it was in 1415 very famous, that whole campaign. We're getting to that. And he made a will, John Philip, that is. And he was actually really generous to Alice, considering she was a little girl whom he had probably met twice.
Mm.
And he left her. Well, some of the typical stuff, a gold cup and exactly one room furnished in his manner, but he also shared his whole possessions, his whole lands with her. So they had joint ownership of all that, which is really enormous. And it probably shows that Thomas Chaucer was putting his foot down about what his daughter was going to get, but he kept to it. And then they all went off to France, except Thomas Chaucer, who decided he was sick. He wasn't much of a
Decided.
fighter, the man. He was in France, but he was sick very, very quickly and escaped everything. And then John Philip promptly died at Hafler during the siege. There, a lot of people died there, mostly of dysentery. So also her future father-in-law, Michael de la Pole, also died there. And Alice was then a widow at most 11 years old, and a very rich widow, which is hard for me to imagine because I've got a niece who is around that age, and a widow, it just doesn't jive.
Right. That's so young.
Yes. But she was a widow and she was very rich, and she would have therefore become an even better marriage prospect. But for the next few years, we know pretty much nothing. She was 11 and then she wasn't mentioned. There's a couple of mentions of her in her father's household, and there is a suggestion that she was also in France with him a couple of times on diplomatic missions, and Thomas was showing her off. That's my daughter. Maybe he was looking around for another marriage, but we have no evidence, so this is just me guessing. And he certainly took care that Alice was raised and educated really, really well. We know she knew Latin, she knew French, and she knew English. So that at least she had a huge collection of books when she was older. So there would have been a really good education there. Though, of course, we don't really have a lot of details. When she was later responsible for her own son, she had Education for Princes, I think it's called. I'm not quite sure. Maybe it's Virtues of Princes, something like that. Translated for her own son, and saying that she had had a similar education. And this book was actually used for the future Edward V and Edward of Lancaster for their education. So she was basically raised as royalty. It was easy to imagine her father just spoiling their kid.
Okay. So did any of this have to do with the fact of who her grandfather was? Because we haven't even touched on this yet. I think this is fascinating.
Probably. Well, Alice never met her grandfather, that Geoffrey Chaucer. He died around 4 years before she was born, and he died in 1400, and she was born in 1404. And but certainly her father also had connections into the literary scene for obvious reasons because of that. And that he also had a lot of poets in his circle, in his household. John Lydgate, for example, who later on would dedicate one of his works to Alice, actually. That there may or may not have been because her second husband, we are getting to him later, asked him to do that for her because, as everyone whom Alice ever met, he was intent on spoiling her. I have no idea how she did it, but I need her tips.
I know she sounds quite amazing and alluring, maybe is the best word.
Yes, definitely. So anyway, she would have had a lot of that around her from early childhood on. So probably her father thought that her knowing a lot of languages, a lot of words, that was something that should be supported.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, let's continue on with her story then. So she is a wealthy widow. Her
Yes.
father is possibly taking her to France with him, maybe looking for some marriage prospects. What ends up happening?
Well, they found a marriage prospect, but we do not know how, and I would really love to know why, how and why, and just generally, because her next husband, he was not only a nobleman, he was quite an important nobleman, the commander of the English forces in France, just saying. That's the Earl of Salisbury, Thomas Montagu. He was also he was seen as a really, really strong and admirable warrior type. He was even praised in French sources, which you wouldn't exactly expect given that he fought against them.
Right.
So he was a very important man. He had already been married and he had a daughter who was only like 3 or 4 years younger than Alice, and she was also called Alice because of course she was. That's Alice Montagu, who was the mother of the future Earl of Warwick
Okay.
and also the first woman to be attainted in England. So she was quite important herself.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's
That's a
another
very important
story.
family right there.
Yes, that's fascinating.
Sister-in-law of Cecil and Neville, just saying. Um, so yeah, we're getting into these sorts of connections quite early. And well, we do not know why this man chose to marry Alice because he was a nobleman and he was rich and he was important. So we assume he probably could have found a better match, at least nobility-wise, than Alice, and probably even somebody who was at least as wealthy. So no idea. Maybe were introduced to each other, and he decided, why not? I already have a daughter. What about it? We don't know.
Yeah. Well, was he looking for a son?
Probably, but a more noble woman could have probably given him a son. Again, we do not actually know if may have had short-lived sons before that.
Okay.
He only got the earldom, I think, in 1420 because his father had been a rebel against Henry the Fourth, and well, he got his earldom back then. So maybe before that, a short-lived son wouldn't have been recorded. But again, it's guesswork. A lot of it is guesswork, sadly.
Yeah. And he was older than Alice as well, too, right?
Yes, I think it was around 16 years.
Yeah. Wow.
So when they married, this was around a year or two after his first wife had died, in 1422, probably shortly after the death of Henry V. He died also of dysentery in August 1422, just after his own son was born, and then became the future Montagu, and then became the Henry VI. And Thomas Montagu was in the group of people who was leading him home for the funeral. And it seems at around that time he arranged to marry Alice and they married then. So she would have been 18 and he would have been 34.
Oh,
So
wow.
they're both adults, even by modern standards, but there's still quite an age gap.
Yeah, for sure. So, what kind of marriage did they have? What did it appear to be a happy marriage or just one of arrangement?
Now, it seemed to be a quite happy marriage, actually. They lived together quite a bit, except he was often in France, so maybe that helped. He was a nice guy, but you don't always have to have him around. Uh, but we don't actually know. We know that he was, again, spoiling her quite a bit. There's recorded gifts of jewels and stuff, but maybe if you're marrying a rich nobleman, that's to be expected.
Mm.
Uh, and a funny anecdote I really like is that he had taken two oaths, the sort of oath that men at the time always did. If I survive this illness, I will ta make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And
Mm.
he had made two of those. And then after he had married Alice, he somehow appealed to the Pope to cancel those oaths if he gave a lot of money to the Pope. And it worked. And I'm just imagining just what he told the Pope as to why, because that's not recorded.
No.
It coincides with him marrying Alice, and like a year afterwards, he canceled those oaths. Oaths? I have no idea. Plural of
Yeah.
oath.
This fat. I just like from what you've said already about Alice, I just picture her as this like gorgeous woman, very intelligent, with charisma, who guys just couldn't resist her.
That's definitely the case. At least we also know when she was then married to Salisbury, she was also in France with them a lot. And there's a quite famous incident that happened at the marriage of two Burgundians. I forgot their names, but it doesn't matter. Uh, it was a big thing. A lot of nobles were there, Burgundians, yeah, Frenchmen and English. And Philip, the Duke of Burgundy, was also there, and Philip was a bit of a ledge. But there's a there's a there's a couple of sources, but I always use Fenner because he was there, it seems, and he was just going on how hot Alice was, and she was very beautiful. She was very beautiful, as I have said before, at least 3 times, and. Then he reported that Philip also thought so, and bec even though her husband was there, decided he would hit on her, and she just sent him packing because that's what you do if you're a commoner born woman who the Duke of Burgundy comes. As I say, she was outspoken, but it's interesting that none of the sources ever blamed her. So you would think that with the medieval sources, what was she doing? Why is she leading the man astray, sort of thing? But it didn't happen. But as you might imagine, her husband was just a little bit pissed off at Philip, Duke of Burgundy. So yeah, there was a bit of a rift between the English and the Burgundian forces after that.
She could have started a war.
He could have, but maybe if he'd stayed with his being annoyed at them, he wouldn't have died so early.
Yeah. Well, she lost two husbands to dysentery.
No, she didn't. It's worse.
Oh no.
Um, yeah, she was actually is the siege of Orleans in 1428. Started in 1428. That's towards the end of it. Jeanne d'Arc turned up, so it's a very famous siege.
Mm.
But he ordered that, and that was together with the Burgundian forces, and so he maybe shouldn't have done that. Uh,
Bad
yeah,
idea.
yes, he was the commander, as I've said, and he was climbing a tower to overlook the whole siege in the town, and of course cannons were firing, and one just hit the tower and tore half his face off.
What?
Yes, that's also recorded several sources. It just tore half his face and one eye off, and he didn't even die directly. He lived for 5 more days or something.
Oh my goodness, that's terrible. What a horrible way to die.
Yeah, it's even dysentery is better.
I was just gonna say, I don't mean to laugh. I think it just caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting that that was going to be the way that he came to his end. Holy
No,
cow.
it's quite horrible, yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting that they recorded it as well, with the detail like that.
Well,
Unless,
I suppose a lot of people would have seen it, and he was, as I say, a very important man.
yeah.
Very, very famous, very important.
Holy
And of
cow.
course, it may have very much changed the whole siege in what direction it went.
So how did it end? For those who don't know, how did this battle end?
In loss for the English. It's not a battle, it's a siege. It went on for a month, and then in I think it was May 1429, the France sorry, the French force got a special weapon, Jeanne d'Arc, the Virgin, the Witch, they called her a lot of names.
Mm.
Well, yeah, and under her she wasn't exactly the commander, but she was certainly a sort of leader. And under her leadership, the French forces broke the siege and sent the English forces running.
Joan of Arc, huh?
Yeah,
I love how she comes into this story as well. This is great. Okay, so at this point now, Alice has lost two husbands. She's still relatively young at this point, isn't she?
it would have been 24. Yeah, 24.
Yeah. I mean, by today's standards, I guess that's young. By medieval standards, maybe that might be closer to, I don't know, middle age for the
Not
time.
exactly middle age, but certainly not seen as particularly young, I'd say.
Yeah, so now she's a widow again for the second time. Did she become even wealthier after the death of this
Very
husband?
much because she got half of his stuff. And there's an interesting thing there because she was pregnant when he died, and that's not actually a lot of records of that. I found that out because of the way they split the lands. He may or may have not known before he died, but if he did, he didn't change his will yet. And it was she gets half and his daughter gets half. And she got her half, as it was said, and then his daughter and Alice shared the other half. It was quite weird, and I looked into why, and there was a little girl who was born probably around March or April 1429, and then she died in 1436 or something, sadly. And then
Hmm.
her older sister got all the rest of the stuff that she had had.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so Alice is back on the marriage market. At this point, you would wonder, does she even want to get married again? Or, what did her life look like at that point? Do you think she felt like she needed another marriage?
I'm not sure if she it felt like she needed another marriage, but I think she felt like she needed William de la Pole
Okay, tell me more about this.
because, well, we know they met before that when she was married to Salisbury. And well, he was the commander after Salisbury died. He was his second in command and then took over and failed. Uh, but it wasn't exactly his fault. At least probably not totally. I don't know. I'm not very good at battle stuff.
Sure.
And anyway, he was then they had another battle at Jago shortly afterwards, and he was taken prisoner. So he was an earl because his older brother Michael, the poor boy, had died at Agincourt in 1415.
Mm.
Um, and so he was an earl, but he wasn't very rich because the De La Pole family as well, they had been commoners a couple of generations back, and they were rich, but they weren't rich by noble standards. So he was certainly much less rich than Alice was after the death of her second husband.
Mm.
And so he didn't really have a lot to offer her, and he was in prison, so he even had even less to offer her. There wasn't a lot he could do. But at some point, somehow, they decided to get married, even while he was still in prison. So he didn't have anything to offer her, so it must have been her initiative.
Interesting. Gosh, she is a fascinating woman. I'm so intrigued by her, and I'm so excited that you wrote a book about her because there's so much to learn. And like I said at the beginning, this time period, women just were not documented as well, but it really does seem like she she left a mark on history, didn't she?
Very much. There's another other interesting thing here that it seems like it already happened with Salisbury, but with William, we actually have the documents because she wasn't told that women didn't do that in the 15th century, maybe, or she didn't care because she had a marriage contract. Her husbands couldn't get her to her money without her agreeing. And that's usually the thing was that the husband automatically had all the wife's money, but not Alice's husband's because she said no.
So she had like a prenup.
Yes.
That's amazing. She was so smart. Wow. Okay, so let's talk more about her marriage now with the Earl of Suffolk. And we're coming into the time period now of Henry VI, right?
Yes, he would have been around not quite eight when no, sorry. He would have been around not quite seven when Alice's second husband died.
Okay.
So he would have been closer in age to her own daughter than to her.
Okay.
And he was, of course, still a child when Alice married William de la Pole. William de la Pole returned from prison, and he'd been one of those noble hostages they had at the time of the bastard of Orleans, the brother of Charles of Orleans.
Mm.
And his brother went for him. It was sort of prisoner exchange, so he could get home, get married, and raise all the money needed to, well, his own ransom, so to speak. That's interesting because it gets into the story later when he dies.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and so he went home for the first time in like 15 years. He hadn't been
Wow.
home forever. And it's quite interesting actually because he was also older than Mary he was also older than Alice, 8 years or something, but we're getting more into the normal age gap with her being 26 when they married and he was 34, so that's fairly normal.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and he was an earl. He had been an earl since he was would have been 19. Yeah,
Okay.
19. But he had never gotten married, despite the fact that he sort of needed an heir because he was in a war zone for 15 years, but he had never gotten married and then decided to marry Alice.
Yeah. Well, I suspect it's not very easy to find a bride when you're at war.
Maybe not, but Salisbury managed.
That's true. That is a good point. So he ends up being a pretty close advisor to Henry VI, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. I mean, he was obviously a good choice to be an important man, a good role model at court because of that past as a warrior. He'd fought for France. He'd lost pretty much his entire family in France. He'd lost three of his four brothers and his father in France, and then a bit later, the fourth brother, the priest who had gone for him to be prisoner of the Bastard of Orléans, also died in France. So he would have been somebody who had made a lot of sacrifices for the king, so to speak, and he was respected at the time. He was an obvious choice to be sort of a role model for Henry, and for quite obvious reasons. After all that had happened in France, he was very much for peace, and that was something that Henry himself also was very interested in as he grew up. So it seems it was a professional thing, but also a personal thing of them just getting along. And he was probably some sort of father figure for Henry VI, who, of course, had never met his own father.
Yeah.
And Alice seems to have been accordingly some sort of mother figure, and especially later for Margaret of Anjou, she was some sort of advisor, and she was Alice was very much also there. She wasn't just there to be the wife of this important advisor, but she was actually also always mentioned there, and it's interesting.
Yeah. Let's talk some more about her relationship with Margaret of Anjou because I think that surprised me because you had a whole chapter about Margaret of Anjou and Alice and how they knew each other and that maybe they had met previously.
Well, not before she was considered for Henry VI, but they did certainly meet before he married her.
Mhm.
But let me first get on my soapbox because I'm going on that a bit on in the chapter because there's a lot of things that it starts with Shakespeare. Everything always starts with Shakespeare. Um, where there's this idea that William and Margaret had some sort of relationship, or at least he wanted to, whether or not to manipulate her, we don't know, except of course she was 15. Um, so that's a bit quick, but most people don't work that out, and I think she's about 36 in Shakespeare, so yeah, and it's always a lot of this relationship between these two women is always seen through this man, and I just do not see why. Because
Always.
it's not William was a great guy, but he's not that important right there. There's a lot of that, even in modern books, where she was close to Alice because she wanted to be close to William or something, and there's just no evidence for that. I mean, of course it happens, but not in this case. It doesn't.
Yeah,
Mm,
yeah, that's interesting. It's almost like, I don't know, I don't want to say it's the sexist point of view, but there is definitely something to be said about women versus men in that time and how women were seen.
Definitely is there, yes, and I think it's partly definitely sexism, and partly also because you're looking for some sort of drama as you find it in Hollywood films, where it's some sort of relationship drama when there's a lot of drama that's not relationship to be had.
Yes.
Well, William and Alice were actually super close. He wrote her poems and everything. Very
Oh,
cute.
oh, I love that. I really do like that. So, I mean, you said that Alice could have been seen as some type of advisor or maybe a close friend to Margaret of Anjou.
Yes, I mean, of course, Margaret was the same age as her daughter, who had sadly died. So it would have probably not been that sort of friendship where you are eye to eye. But she was certainly an advisor. There's a lot of evidence that Alice showed her a bit of the ropes of the job and explained to her who was what and why, as you might expect. And of course, there's an interesting anecdote again. Alice was together with William de la Pole, of course. in France to negotiate the marriage. And then they were there when they actually married. And Henry VI didn't actually yet marry her in France because there was the thing that also later happened with, I think it was Henry VIII's sister Mary, where there was this proxy marriage before she went to England or before Mary went to France, just to make sure it's all settled and nobody can prevent it anymore, which was important in that point because the marriage contract wasn't a very popular one because England lost a lot with that.
Mm.
So that it had to be done. And then William stood in for Henry VI, and Margaret was stood in for herself, obviously.
Yeah.
And then they had this sort of processions where she was shown to the population, and as you might expect a 15-year-old girl to be, she got so nervous she got a bit sick, and she couldn't be in that one procession. So Alice stepped in, as you would expect a commoner to do. She wore all the royal stuff, the clothes, the jewels and everything, and just waved to people a bit, as you do, and just stood in for her.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that anecdote because I was just going to bring it up and ask you to tell that story because that was fascinating to me to think that Alice was able to do that and what an honor to be able to sit in for your queen. But like, did the subjects have any idea that that wasn't Margaret?
It probably depends. There's no comment made, but it probably depends on how far off it was. Even if they'd never seen Alice, it's pretty hard to confuse a 15-year-old girl with a woman of around 40. Uh, so, well, they may have actually known and just accepted her to stand in for Margaret as William had stood in for Henry and just gone, whatever. We've planned this, now we do this.
That's fascinating. Okay, so let's fast forward and here we are. We're back in England. We're at the English court now. What did their lives look like now that Henry had a queen and they had this royal court underway? What did the life of William and Alice look like?
Well, it was probably a bit more busy than it had been before. Like in the 1430s, they had apparently a very, well, I wouldn't say relaxing. They were at court already, and but it wasn't as politically charged. In the 1430s, and I have to mention this now, they also had Charles of Orleans, who was a prisoner in England for 25 years, he also stayed with them for 3 or 4 years, and they became quite close friends. It was nice. It seems to have been a fairly relaxing time, and now it was more. There had to be a lot of decisions made. Of course, the war in France, it was still going on, and it kept being worse and worse all the time. There was a lot of discontent, especially after Margaret, after like 3 or 4 years, still hadn't had a child. So it was, why did we make this marriage? Why lose all these um, parts of land in France? Why? And they all had to go against it. There was also this was later led to the Wars of the Roses. The fact that there were a lot of fractions and it became worse all during the 1440s. So they would have had to be very diplomatically involved.
Hmm.
And of course, they also had a son by then. He was 3 years old when Margaret and Henry married, so they would have also wanted to secure his future. So they would have been busy, certainly.
Yeah, yeah. And what a crazy time to be living too with the Wars of the Roses. Like I can't, of all the times in English history, and of course there's a lot of there's a lot of times where you go, I probably wouldn't have wanted to live during that time, but the Wars of the Roses just seemed like such a volatile time in history where it was always choosing sides. Did William ever not side with Henry VI?
He would have had a hard time because he died in 1450.
Okay, well, let's talk about that then. What happened to William?
Well, as I say, there were a lot of fractions and it kept becoming worse and worse. And there's a lot of evidence that in around 1448, then when Henry made William a duke, And the dukes were almost always before that, if not always. I don't know if William was the first non-royal duke, or if he wasn't, he was certainly one of the very first.
Oh.
And that didn't go over so well because, first of all, it seemed like choosing blatantly a side in the whole fraction thing, which as a king you probably shouldn't do. And secondly, as I said, William himself wasn't of all that impressive ancestry. So a lot of people were going, usually it's a royal thing, and now you give it to this. He's more or less a wool merchant. Well, his grandfather was anyway.
Yeah.
His grandfather wasn't. I think it was great grandfather, but what does it matter at that point?
Yeah.
And there was this massive smear campaign, and we do not actually know who is behind it, but it may have been Richard, Duke of York, or Duke of Somerset, one of those, or both.
Yeah.
But probably both because they didn't like each other either. So there was this massive smear campaign, and it kept being worse and worse. And then in 1450, at the very beginning, then Henry couldn't do anything anymore, and William was charged with treason. And it was an extraordinarily volatile mood in the country. At one point, one of William's servants and a horse were caught by an angry mob, and they were tortured to death, including the horse.
What? Oh my gosh. It just gets worse.
Yes, is violent.
Oh my.
Yeah. So anyway, Henry probably knew that even if he released William, then he would just be killed. So there was this trial, and he was actually not found guilty of treason, but he was found guilty of a lesser charge and banished to exile for 5 years. And this was almost certainly the best Henry could do, get him out of the way until everything blows over and they will have found someone else to be angry at.
Yeah.
But people weren't quite happy with that, and he was intercepted on the way to exile. His ship was intercepted, and he was given a mock trial and beheaded. Oh, and his ring stolen. And well, somebody had to get the formerly royal ship to intercept William's ship and start that. So it wouldn't have been an angry mob without anyone behind it. But who was behind it, we can't say. I mean, it was probably Richard of York. At least William's son seemed to think it was Richard of York, but we can't say for certain. But he was dead. There's quite a good description of it in one of the Paston letters.
Wow. Wow. Just, there's so much tragedy during this time. And then here we are again. Now Alice is a widow for the third time.
And not in a good position. After the second time she was widowed, she was the widow of a highly respected man, and at this point she was also accused of treason.
Hmm.
Not officially, because Henry didn't do that, but just shortly afterwards, the Jack Cade rebellion happened. Some people, I think Matthew Lewis, for example, say this is the first bit of the Wars of the Roses, really.
Hmm.
But even if it wasn't, it was just about to start. They had this rebellion, and they had all these demands against some of William's men and one woman, and it was Alice. She was the only woman they picked out there. So this also says a lot about how she was seen, how important she was seen as.
It's
Of course, the rebellion was beaten down, and Alice was neither banished nor otherwise punished, but it seems that at that point she decided she needed to step back a bit and try and get through all this safely with her son.
I'm fascinated and I'm curious also her what am I trying to say? Alice seems to just have had this reputation at court and like you said she was attached to this rebellion and I'm curious was she ever like did they ever call her a witch or anything like that like other strong women of that time?
They called her another name ending in itch, but not a witch.
All right, I got you. I got you. I'm following you there. All right. Well, that's interesting because, of course, I immediately think of somebody like Elizabeth Woodville or Jacquetta of Luxembourg and that whole thing. It's like you get some beautiful, powerful women, and that's the first thing that they do is throw that label on you to try and get rid of you.
I have two theories on that. The first one is probably not enough in itself, but there was never any attack against their private life. There was against Jacquetta, for example, and never against Alice or William because doesn't seem to have been something. And the second one is she was connected to the very, very powerful Nevilles
Hmm.
because her stepdaughter, Alice Montagu, was married to them, and they were on the other side. Basically, they were the Yorkist side, but they were still at least on friendly terms with her, and she might not have taken it very nicely if somebody suggested that her father had been bewitched.
Yeah.
So they probably stopped at that.
Oh, this has been so fun. Okay, so I promised at the beginning that we would bring this full circle and we would talk about the connection to the Tudors. And I think now is the perfect time, now that William has died, for us now to look at his son and who his son ended up marrying.
Yeah, his son, John de la Pole, he was originally, well, we start at the beginning when he was around 2 years old. His parents were given the wardship of Margaret Beaufort, the future mother of Henry VII, and they ignored it. Just nothing. Absolutely nothing happened. Then 2 years later, they bought the wardship of another young girl. That's uh, uh sorry, Anne Beecham. That's
Hmm.
the niece of the Earl of Warwick, and she lived with them, and she was meant to marry little John, but she died in at the age of around 4 of something that kids died of at the time.
Yeah.
And nobody ever blamed them for it, so we assume it was just something obvious because that was another thing people liked throwing around if they. Mm. So shortly before William was killed, and they saw that they were losing power, even no matter what Henry VI could do, and they tried to secure the marriage to the future of little John. They married him to Margaret Beaufort.
Oh,
I
you
think
did.
before that happened, and after William died, their mothers, so that's Alice and Margaret's mother, also called Margaret Beaufort just because. They had three names altogether. They wrote to the Pope and said they wanted this marriage to go ahead, which it did for 3 years. And then when John was 11 and Margaret was 10, or maybe Margaret was 9 and John was 10, they were just 7 months apart. The marriage was cancelled, and Margaret will go on to marry Edmund Tudor.
Yeah.
That's obvious that we have a Tudor. And John would then go on to marry Richard of York's daughter, his second daughter, Elizabeth.
Mm.
The original Elizabeth of York, if you want.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, Michelle, this has been so fun today talking about Alice and her life. And I want to know before we go, is there anything that you want to leave us with about Alice that maybe we did not discuss today?
I think we pretty much discussed it all, except one thing. One thing, sorry, we have to circle back on that because Alice died in 1475
Oh, yeah.
at 71, which is pretty old for the time. So she lived through quite a lot of the Wars of the Roses, and she managed single-handedly to be respected by both sides.
Wow, that's impressive. She really was quite the impressive woman for her time, wasn't she?
Yes, she was.
I'm surprised she
Uh,
wasn't burned as a witch or something.
well, she had the nice contacts. If you
Yeah,
burn her as a witch, then somebody is going to get it. She even had contacts in France.
it's all about who you know, isn't it?
Yeah, it always is.
Well, Michelle, thank you so much. And if people want to go out and get your book, where can they find it?
Well, it's probably in any bigger bookshop and of course on Amazon. The Emily Publishing website should have it on under their books. And if somebody wants to ask me, I'll find them. One can even sign it.
I love that. And the book is called Who is Better Than a Good Woman, right?
What is better than a good woman?
Oh, I wrote it down wrong. Let's do it again.
That's a quote from Geoffrey Chaucer.
It is. I was going to
It
ask
is.
you about that too. What is better than a good woman? Where did I get who? I must have been writing that down really fast.
Probably.
So you not only have that book, but we also mentioned the one on Francis Lovell. Let everybody know what that one's called as well.
That one's called Love Our Dog. Um, yeah, Life
Perfect.
of Viscount Lovell.
Okay. And if people do want to reach out to you and ask you questions, where can they find you?
I'm on Facebook and I'm not calling it X, I'm on Twitter. And well, I'm also on Instagram, but I'm not really active there. I just watch cute dog videos. But I should be able to be found, especially on Facebook.
Okay, perfect. Well, Michele, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge with us today.
And thank you for having me.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.